The gap between what men and women earn is an important indicator of both equality and equity. The gender pay gap still features prominently as a stumbling block in achieving significant South African gender equality. Reigniting the debate on strengthening and improving legislation and the monitoring of gender pay transparency measures, my colleague Liesl Wilson caught up with Professor Anita Bosch, the Research Chair of Women at Work at the University of Stellenbosch Business School. Have a look at this.
Professor, thank you very much for joining us here on Weekend Dawn. It is Women's Month. We're looking at the options of equity, equality, inclusivity, some of the gender norms and even attitudes that persist in society today, perhaps how we can take those conversations and actually really implement change. I think we're just going to start off with that report that was released in March of 2020. I mean, overall, what was the focus of the report? What trends did it unearth?
I'm particularly interested in starting to see change. We've spoken about the gender pay gap for quite a while, and it's a topic that people are aware of, and sometimes they believe in it, and sometimes they just don't. The article was written in the South African Journal of Science. It was written by me and a co-author, Shimon Barrett, about gender pay transparency mechanisms. And in it, we make a number of recommendations based on an analysis of 16 countries across the globe, the transparency mechanisms that they're using, and then we look at what South Africa has in place, and we make recommendations for the future. The article specifically addresses really actually four major areas, but of interest to practitioners, the public out there. It's available for free download on the website, the South African Journal for Science website. And what people can do is, for instance, practitioners, legislators, union members, I think it's a really good read because it does an overview of these global mechanisms, which are very interesting. I mean, a lot of countries move from making pay information quite public and naming and shaming to fines and all kinds of other mechanisms. Iceland, for instance, and New Zealand always have fantastic legislation in place. And my take on that is they're small communities. And so they've come to realize that you have to use both men and women to make your economy tick. And that the one is not more important than the other, or the one does not necessarily have to stick to traditional roles in comparison to the other.
Prof, you've spoken about the global context and some of the countries and perhaps how it's going to be adapted to a South African context. So in lieu of this, I mean, what was unearthed? Why does the pay gap exist in South Africa? And ultimately, how do we strengthen the mechanisms already in place to ensure that we're not only talking, but we're walking that talk?
Yes. When we look at a study that was done over 25 years of panel data, econometric panel data by Jacqueline Musomi of UCT, in her study, she really illustrated that there's differences in the pay structure. So it depends on where you are in South Africa in the pay structure. Since the dawn of democracy, the pay gap has narrowed quite substantially for women in the bottom of in other words, the lowest paid women. And she ascribes that to the fact that there's a national minimum wage that's been put in place. And so because of that, everybody's paid basically the same. The middle of the band is a problematic area because there's quite a substantial gap still. And then again, strangely enough, in the past 10 years, the gap has become wider again in the upper percentiles of the pay gap band. Now here there should not be differences because these are women that have exactly the same level of education. They've been appointed because they've got the experience, but yet there it is growing. And that's really highly problematic. So what we know for policy interventions is that we have to target specifically. We cannot say that all policy interventions must be the same for everybody in the pay band. What we're suggesting is, for instance, that for a start, that we start strengthening our pay reporting. We already have a measure of pay reporting, according to the Employment Equity Act, for those companies that are regarded as designated employers that employ more than 50 people. Here we want more detailed criteria, more detailed measures put in place, and then on top of that, for it to progressively be made public. I also just want to say something about smaller employers. We're very clear in our article that we don't want to overburden smaller employers. So there we're relying on an employer and an entrepreneur to be fair in their payment. But companies that are regarded as designated employers, those with 50 or more employees, here we feel they have the mechanisms and the means to actually do proper pay reporting.
All right. So, Prof, just looking at, so was there anything else you wanted to add? Sorry, you can keep going. I'll edit it.
So the other aspects that we're asking for is that we start making pay audits mandatory for those designated employers. Because what a pay audit does, it's different than just reporting on some measures that looking at the difference between the top and the lowest earning employee and so on. With a pay audit, you're actually searching for where those gaps are in your pay structure. And yes, the EE Act allows us to have differences between employees for the same job even. And there's particular things like seniority, experience, level of performance. But what we're saying is in a pay audit, you have to look for those gaps that remain stagnant over time and cannot be explained by virtue of any of those particular issues. Also, where differences occur, a company actually has to consistently apply those different measures. That's another important aspect. And here, the difficulty comes in if an employee feels that they're being paid differently and there's discrimination involved, the access to that data is highly problematic.
So, Prof, in lieu of this, I mean, just looking at the progress that has been made, the call to action, what does it look like in terms of your JSE-listed companies and some of the upper percentile, women who are, sorry, not upper percentile, I'll start again. So, Prof, in a South African context, what does this look like in terms of implementation? Obviously, these recommendations have been put forth. Now, you've got the data to back it up from March of 2020 since it was published. But ultimately, I mean, who's come on board to actually take this data and translate it?
Well, I was very fortunate to do a presentation on the adaptation of the Women's Charter in Parliament. And so these recommendations have been put forward there to the National Council of Provinces. We're really hoping that the recommendations would be taken up in, say, some form. The other quick win that we could have is if the JSE just looks at their listing requirements, which at the moment takes the King report and the King codes as mandatory for listed companies. And we say that the JSE can tweak that ever so slightly by stating that when listed companies do their annual reports, they are obliged to report on the gender pay gap. And also to have some standardized way in which the reporting happens. Because if we analyze annual reports, very often the information is so convoluted and so differently presented that a comparison is near impossible. The other thing that we're really asking is for the CIPC to work with universities. The University of Stellenbosch Business School is very keen to work with the CIPC in terms of data and to make sure that we can actually report more publicly on, for instance, the number of women in senior positions, the number of women directors. All of this information is important for oversight and transparency, nationally speaking.
Now, Prof, we also have to look at South Africa in a broader societal context. Sorry, there's a sign that says your internet connection is unstable. Okay. Now, Prof,
Okay.
we have to also look at South Africa in a broader societal context. And as I mentioned earlier on, there are gender norms, attitudes that obviously permeate in society. If we look at the root causes of some of these systemic issues that contribute to these outlooks and even practices, what was unearthed in that regard? And how do we, slowly rewrite those narratives to benefit all of us? As you mentioned, when women are included in the economy, poverty is reduced and the economy ultimately grows at large.
This is a very important point, because women usually have extended family members that they support more so than male-dominated households. The gender-based violence, I think there's a very strong link to economic necessity and need attached to that. What we know is that South Africa is a very traditional society in terms of gender norms, and quite essentialist about it as well. Issues such as what marriage means, whether women are seen as being owned by men in some shape or form, and the value that women can bring to the workplace and to the economy. Those things are very traditionally viewed. So our culture really needs to start adapting. There's clear signs of it morphing ever so slightly, but we all have a role to play. And I think the most important thing is to start having these discussions at home, for us to, bring the overlap into the workplace. And at least in the workplace, there's some sense of neutrality. There's never neutrality per se in life, but at least the workplace offers us this platform where we can say what norms, we can actually explicitly state what norms against which we want to work. And that's actually an area of our society that we can use to bring these types of concepts back into households and to help people make sense of it. But discussions are really the starting point of creating awareness around the issues.
And then I also just want to bring in the issue of men. Obviously, they've also got a role to play at large. In your opinion, how would you say they can effectively lead this change as well, or be part of leading that change?
Well, during COVID, it is just astonishing to see the number of articles that have acknowledged women's differential role and how women have been impacted. I'd like to broaden that to primary caregivers, and so there would be some men that are primary caregivers. But if you're a primary caregiver, you're likely to be much more negatively affected. So men have a massive role to play if they are not viewing themselves or placing themselves in the role of primary caregiver, to step in and take up some of those responsibilities. I think a lot of that doesn't happen, and we see this in German studies that have been done, where women are the primary breadwinner in a household, and then what happens is the care obligations just get outsourced. So men are not taking up those care obligations. We really have to understand that if we feel that family is part of the core of South Africans' ethos, the way we want to live and be, then men should step in equally and take up equal roles in terms of family caregiving, and women should also sometimes step aside slightly to allow men to take that up. Men have a very important role to play in terms of the effect of gender equality.